The relationship between war and drugs is not new. Most wars have seen the heavy usage of drugs like alcohol, cocaine, opium, LSD, and many more. These drugs were used in various ways. For example, soldiers used these drugs to help their nerves calm down. Mass people took these drugs for entertainment purposes. The scenario during the Cold War was not much different than this. To be specific, the use of psychoactive drugs was at the peak during Cold War. Maybe you're thinking that it was just an effect of the Cold War, but it was not. There are some crucial backstories behind the use of drugs during the Cold War. Today, in this video, we're going to unveil these stories. So guys, welcome back to Uncovering Mythology and History. Please subscribe to our channel to get more videos like this. Now, let's get started. Relation between drugs and war. Though the relationship between drugs and war is not new, you may ask, what's the relation about? Basically, war and drugs are two stories of the same thread. This relation can be of various types. For example, it can be a war through drugs, a war against drugs, a war for drugs, a war while on drugs, or it can be a war after drugs. So, we can say that drugs and war always have had a very close relationship. Let's talk about wars while on drugs to understand this better. The term wars while on drugs indicates the wars where soldiers fight while they are on some kind of drugs. Those drugs can be of any type, but mostly soldiers take psychoactive or mind-altering drugs while fighting. We know that drugs help to calm down our nerves, and that's one of the main reasons why people get addicted to drugs. War is a very stressful event that is very hard to cope with. So, soldiers take some drugs to keep their nerves calm so they can cope with the situation. Other than soldiers, mass people also use various kinds of drugs to cope with the hardship of wartime. We can talk about alcohol, tobacco, caffeine, and many more. The study of war and drugs mostly talks about illegal drugs and how they are connected to rebellion and fighting against rebellion. People worry about rebels in Colombia who get money from selling cocaine and insurgents in Afghanistan who make money from selling opium. This has made the terms narco-guerrilla and narco-terrorist famous. This topic is also connected to debates about things like valuable resources that can be taken during a conflict and whether conflicts are caused by greed or anger. However, it is often forgotten that using drug money to fund the war is not a new idea, and legal drugs have been important in this. Though the relationship between drugs and war is ancient, is it similar to the use of drugs during the Cold War? No, it is not. The Cold War and use of drugs. The Cold War was a geopolitical conflict between the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc that lasted from 1947 to 1991. Western Bloc was led by the United States and NATO, and the Eastern Bloc was led by the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. The conflict was primarily economic and political. This was marked by intense diplomatic propaganda and proxy wars fought between communist and capitalist countries. The two sides were never directly engaged in a full-scale military conflict, and that's why the term Cold War appears. The tensions between the two superpowers was a major factor in shaping international relations in the second half of the 20th century. You may ask, if there was no war then, what was the role of drugs then? The answer is not so easy. During the Cold War, drug use was widespread in many countries, particularly among young people. In the US, using drugs like marijuana and cocaine was a big problem. The government thought that communists were behind this. So they started a war on drugs to stop drug use and sales through police and block it from coming into the country. However, this plan was expensive, didn't work well, and mostly affected black communities. People in charge like Harry Anslinger said that the communists wanted to ruin capitalism and take over the world using drugs. They thought Fidel Castro helped China as they were trying to hurt the US by using drugs. Anslinger even told Congress that using marijuana makes people passive and easier to control with communist ideas. People who were against drugs saw it as fighting against communism during the Cold War. But later, the CIA was accused of bringing drugs into the US illegally to get money to fight communism in Central America. This was a controversial and difficult subject with big consequences during the Cold War. A former police detective from Los Angeles said that the CIA had been selling drugs in the US for a long time. People have been accusing the government of putting too many hard drugs on the street. They said that the CIA and the police were bringing drugs into the cities and especially to African American communities. It was part of a secret plan to keep them from being successful. People started talking about this more in the 1980s when there was a lot of crack cocaine being used. But is this true? Did the CIA really sell cocaine in the cities during the Cold War? The story started in Central America. In 1979, the leader of Nicaragua was removed from power by a group of people who wanted a fair government. The people who didn't like this change started a war. They got money and weapons from the CIA as part of the fight against the Soviet Union. But in 1982, the people in the US who control the laws stopped giving money to the people fighting in Nicaragua. So the CIA and the fighters needed to find a new way to get money. And what they found? They found it with cocaine. In the 1970s, more people in the US started to breathe cocaine. It was mostly coming from Colombia. In the early 1980s, a new type of cocaine called crack became popular in American cities. This made a lot of money for criminal groups, even those backed by the CIA. The Contras were linked to Colombian drug cartels. It was a group fighting the government in Nicaragua. In 1985, 2 journalists reported that the Contras were involved in trafficking cocaine. They also reported that the CIA knew about it and allowed it to happen to help fund their war effort. The journalists lost their jobs because their bosses did not like their stories. The CIA denied any involvement in the drug trade, but people started to think that the government was allowing crack cocaine to be sold. These rumors continued until 1996. After that, a reporter named Gary Webb looked into the story again. Webb investigated the case of a man named Freeway Rick Ross. He was the biggest drug dealer in Los Angeles in the early 1980s. Webb found out that Ross's main cocaine supplier was a Nicaraguan man named Danilio Blandon. This Blandon used Miami banks to send the money from the drug trade back to the Contras. The story of Dark Alliance became popular not just because of the surprising information it shared, but also because of the internet. The internet was the new and powerful tool of the time. This was one of the first big pieces of journalism that were printed in a newspaper and also available online. The story quickly spread, with people from all walks of life talking about it. From protesters and radio hosts to politicians who want to criticize the Reagan and Bush administrations. The CIA director even had to defend the agency at a public meeting. However, the reaction from the main media was surprising. Instead of investigating the CIA, big newspapers like the LA Times, Washington Post, and the New York Times criticized the journalist who wrote the story, Gary Webb. He was forced to leave his job and eventually took his own life in 2004. In 1998, a reporter from the CIA's Inspector General confirmed that many parts of Dark Alliance were true. The CIA allowed people connected to the Contras to bring cocaine into the country. Along with that, the CIA also protected them from investigations. So, we can say that the US government allowed millions of people to suffer from a drug war problem because of the Cold War. Well guys, that's a wrap. But wait, before you go, don't forget to share your thoughts on this video in the comments section. Give us a big thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and don't forget to hit the bell icon to stay in the loop. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next one.